Hey, what's going on? Don't be laughing. Don't be judging. You know, man, we're all individuals. I'm doing me. You do you. We all make our own plans. We all do what we want to with our lives. There's no reason getting all picky about how somebody else is living their life. That's up to them. What? Oh, you want a lecture? Well, I guess you paid for the class. I contracted to do it, so suppose I'm obligated. Fine. Hello, and welcome to Ethics and Leadership, where today we're going to be talking about Robert Nozick and his version of libertarianism. So, Nozick, like Rawls actually, was a professor at Harvard, but unlike Rawls, he certainly did not get any of that sense of noblesse oblige, that there's a general obligation to pay other people back simply because you've been lucky in your life. That was not part of his philosophy. No, his philosophy was something different entirely. His philosophy was based on individualism. I know that it might not look like it, but I'm an individual who's marked by dignity. That's what all this is about, is my dignity. Because my dignity basically means that I get to choose what to do with my life, and you ought to stay out of the way. At least until I start infringing upon your rights. And in case you thought you had a right never to see this, nope. But Nozick's kind of a radical even when it comes to rights, because he does believe that our rights are not inalienable. So as long as I agree to it, I can even agree to a violation of my own rights. As long as you're down and I'm down, everything's game. So let's start talking about Robert Nozick and his form of libertarianism. Okay, some significant stuff has come about in between Rawls and Nozick, although really, not between them, because Rawls was kind of at the tail end of the period when the welfare state was functioning up and running and going really well. What happened at the beginning of the 80s and really at the end of the 70s was that there was a breakdown in the American economy, and that had to do with an oil shortage that basically short-circuited all of America's attempts to keep the economy up and running. And really people got upset, and they decided at some point in there that they really wanted to try something else. They wanted to experiment with some other kind of economy. And this was just in time for Ronald Reagan to show up on the stage. And Reagan had a new vision that would eventually take over in America, at least becoming the most influential form of politics from the 1980s until today. And this politics emphasized small government, personal responsibility, and personal freedom. Reagan was not quite so far out as some of those who would go so far as to call themselves libertarians, but the libertarian wing of the Republican Party ended up becoming incredibly powerful. And this is how it was that conservatism came eventually to mean like favoritism for a small government, even if that required changing everything in American society. You see, conservatism used to be like being conservative about conserving things, but now it just meant like small government was what it tended to mean. Now, this governing philosophy never really entirely worked out, because while Republican leaders liked cutting taxes, nobody actually liked cutting the services that the government provided for people and that they had provided for people all the way back and from the welfare state. So government expenditures continued at fairly high levels, even though the government continually tended to cut back on taxes, and this led to a huge deficit in the country, which continues to grow today. And today, the Republican Party is not really entirely libertarian as much as they're kind of searching for an identity of exactly what they're going to be for the future. But really, from a fairly long period, from the 1980s even to the 2010s, Libertarianism was a highly influential philosophy in our society, and that held as much for Democrats as it did for Republicans. I mean, Bill Clinton was the small government Democrat. He came in and actually cut Social Security and cut back on some of those welfare things that had been left over from the heyday of the welfare state. Interestingly, Nozick and Rawls actually wrote their most significant books within a couple years of each other. But Rawls was in many ways justifying the welfare state, which was already passing out of existence, and Nozick was, in some ways, the wave of the future, even if it never came to be exactly as he kind of imagined that it would. Philosophy rarely works out in practice as it does on paper. This is Robert Nozick. He looks so 1970s suave there, doesn't he? Don't judge him. He can do whatever he wants. He's an individual. Interestingly, Nozick starts off not that far from where Rawls starts off, with the general rejection of utilitarianism. Although their arguments aren't exactly the same. I mean, both of them would generally agree that individuals are inviolable, right? That word that just meant having dignity and having fundamental rights. But Nozick's problem wasn't about the way that utilitarianism didn't pay attention to distribution. It was only about the way that utilitarianism could be used in abusive ways against particular individuals. We can get at this with a story by Ursula Le Guin, who wrote The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Now, Omelas is this great, wonderful city where everybody's just supremely happy and wonderful, except for that their happiness depends upon, by some magical relationship, depends upon this one child that's left in a room that's closed off from the outside world, and no one can interact with this child, because if they do, it'll kind of break the spell, and the society will lose its utilitarian utopian quality where everybody's happy all the time and everything's going wonderful. So that child is left down there crying and being left in this closet of a room, living in its own filth, and basically left out of society entirely. Now, Le Guin wrote that story in part to take a look at what utilitarianism might actually come out with. Because for the utilitarian, if you just do a calculus of all the happiness of all the people, well, if it made everybody really happy to have that situation, I mean, it's only the one child that's suffering, so it seems like that would be okay. Well, this is exactly what Nozick was worried about with utilitarianism. He was worried that it didn't recognize the rights of individuals, and it allowed individuals to be abused in a political system. Now, in response to this, Nozick suggests that we ought to adopt a system that is fundamentally Lockean, but maybe even uber Lockean, which doesn't mean the car service, but just means super. So super Lockean, where he says, look, what we ought to assume is something like Locke assumed in the state of nature. But we don't have to have a state of nature to know about this, because we just know about the fundamental separateness of human beings, that we are fundamentally different from each other. I don't feel what you feel, you don't feel what I feel. And so there is no aggregate that collects all of these different feelings together, as if the society has some overall utility or lack thereof. No, every individual has their own feelings and their own experiences. And because of this, he says, because of this fundamental separateness of individuals, we need to start with individuals and absolute individual rights as a starting point. So none of this Rawlsian stuff where we step behind the veil of ignorance and then from this kind of unbiased standpoint we decide to figure out that people are unviolable. No. We ought to start with it, not even mess around with any account of social justice before we get to the inviolability of individuals. So in some senses, this is back to the state of nature, but we don't even need the state of nature. We just know about our individual rights. our individual rights, as Nozick says, are pre-political, pre-contractual, and he's thinking primarily negative rights here. So I have the right not to be interfered with. If you remember, the positive rights were the idea that I had a right that somebody else needed to provide me with something if I didn't have it. So if I was starving, other people had an obligation to provide me with those goods that I needed. But no, he says, our rights are negative rights. They're rights not to be interfered with. And you remember that this goes back to the fundamental separateness between individuals, according to Nozick. And much like Locke, he's in the liberal tradition, right? So he thinks about these rights primarily in terms of life, liberty, and property. This is why he's like an uber-Lockean in some ways, is that that's really what we're talking about. And as a matter of fact, that's really all that we're talking about when we talk about morality is everybody staying out of my way in areas that I haven't agreed that they can be in my way, right? So any relationships that I have, if they're going to be moral relationships with other people, are going to be contractual relationships where we sit down and I express my own will about how we're going to relate to each other. And if I'm going to have any duties at all, at any point, to anyone, it's only going to be created by contractual relations that I have with other people. Now, starting in this way is why Nozick thinks that the primary argument that he's going to have to make, the primary contender for a state is going to be anarchy, just the absence of a state, because every individual is their own individual, and it seems like, at least at first, in order to get off the ground with a state, you're going to have to violate somebody's individual rights, because you get into all this stuff about providing security, and then there's taxation that comes into that, and I mean, even most libertarians actually accept like some justification of some violation of rights, but Nozick wanted to try and get around all of that. So he decided to take on anarchy and see if there was a way to get past anarchy with individual rights established and protected. Okay, so the first thing you need to understand about radical individual rights is there is no right to protection of your rights. What? What? Okay, this doesn't mean you can't protect your rights. You have a total right to protect your rights if you want to. You can fight other people and you can, I mean, if we get society off the ground and there are guns and whatever else, sure, I mean, have fun. But you have no right for somebody else to provide you protection of your rights. You see, if there were a right that other people had to provide you with protection, that would be a positive right. Other people would have the duty of providing you with protection. So there is no such thing as a right to provide you with protection. So we certainly can't justify a government on the basis that you have a right to be protected in your rights, because that doesn't follow from our negative rights. So at this point, the only thing that we could allow for these radical individuals with their perfect individual rights is to allow them to start shopping for their own protection. So we know that people can set up contractual relations by expressing their will and having agreements with other people. So instead of just having a right to have your rights protected, you could go out and buy protection for your own rights. I mean, if you produce and claim enough stuff, then you could trade it off with other people so that they'll provide you with some kind of safety. And this is the only way that you could get any safety apparatus actually put in place. If this were the case, if we were in a kind of state of nature and people started moving around and trying to set this up, that there would be a market advantage to a system that in fact was bigger than other systems. This is just usually the way that things go. So take, for instance, that Walmart can offer lower prices than most other places. And why? Because Walmart's bigger. They have more influence over the people who are selling to them, and they can weigh that influence and try and use it in favor of their customers. And similarly, like Amazon, one of the reasons that Amazon is able to provide good prices is because it controls a significant amount of territory in the country and can actually use that weight in order to get cheaper prices. Well, Nozick assumes this of these security companies. He also supposes that security companies will have to be able to go back and forth with each other, because when two people get in a fight and they're trying to provide security for them, well, they won't just want to always resolve it by killing the people. I mean, that's not good for business. They'll eventually form systems of dispute resolution, so to figure out who actually had their rights violated by whom and at what time. And eventually he thinks this will develop into something like a kind of court system amongst these security firms that are providing security to people. And it'll be cheaper to have that court system to be internal to one company rather than spread out through multiple companies. So that one company who's taken over and is actually providing kind of the best service to people, and will then also develop this system of dispute resolution and get even bigger. And really, by the end of the day, they take over most of the market share in the country. I mean, there's not really a country. By the end of the day, they take over the majority of market share in their region, whatever that is. I mean, I guess we're going to consider that a country. But it's not really a country with, like, borders or anything like that. It's just the company has that much area. So at this point, you would have a kind of monopoly that's given to this one country over security. Now, there might be issues with some other kind of minority representation companies that are out there providing security. And in order to call this a state, Nozick supposes that what will eventually happen is that the company will come in and they'll offer members of those smaller firms exchanges. Well, they say, well, we'll provide you with security at a discounted rate if you stop actually offering your services. So the company will basically take over as a clear monopoly over the region where they're the only one who provides security. This then becomes what Nozick calls the minimal state, or the night watchman state. But it doesn't reflect what you think of if you think of a state. It's not really a government. It's really still a private security company. And as a matter of fact, Nozick posits that it won't actually need to gather together taxes. This means that not everybody is actually contracting with the state in order to provide security. So, while I contract with the state, my neighbor might not contract with the state. So if robbers come to my house and start invading my house, I can call, 911, whatever the number is for this minimal state, and they'll send police officers out. But my neighbor, well, he's on his own, or she's on her own, because she doesn't pay the state the money. So if she calls 911, they'll say, I'm sorry, you're not one of our customers, good night. So there are no taxes in this system because taxation is robbery, right? I mean, that's against our individual rights to have somebody come and take away our own private property. Now, we ought to be clear about then the services that this state doesn't provide, because it seems like they'd provide basically security and only to their own customers, but they're not interested in infrastructure like bridges or roads or paving or highways or any of that stuff, right? And Nozick's getting rid of all of the government all the way around unless anybody contractually agrees to the particular form of government. So basically what you'd have is a set of private companies that would provide all of these services to people who want to pay for them. So you'd have a private firefighting service and maybe a private road service that like paved roads if you were willing to pay for it, and private everything, right? Basically, Nozick's minimal state looks very little like what we would think of today as a state or as a government. You don't vote on it. You don't have any of this. It's a company, probably with a president, a CEO, a set of, shareholders that they'd be paying off at the same time. They have a board of trustees, maybe. And then the people, instead of being citizens, right, would be customers to the state. And Nozick thinks that if we went about constructing a state in this way, we could actually do it without violating anybody's rights. So this is how he gets around the argument from anarchists that we shouldn't have any kind of state at all, not even a kind of state that functions as a night watchman or a private security company. Nozick then provides another set of arguments against utilitarianism, and he thinks Rawls, saying that these systems cannot actually provide the basis for a free society at all. So utilitarianism and Rawlsianism, he's going to lump these two basically together because both of them are concerned about overall production in some regard, right? He's going to say that neither one of them can actually provide freedom, even though, Rawls would think that Nozick's wrong about this. In order to get into his argument against utilitarianism and that he thinks also works about Rawls, we're going to have to talk about time slices and end state principles. So basically what he's worried about with this when he talks about time slices and end state principles is the kind of analysis that we've looked at with utilitarianism and Rawlsianism in the difference principle. So if we imagine two different societies and we try and line them up against each other in terms of the distribution within those societies, we can then compare across and we can see which one has the better distribution of goods. And so the Rawlsian and the utilitarian might disagree here, but Rawls agrees that we can use something like this in order to assess the kind of distribution that we have at times, at least under the consideration of the difference principle. Now, off to the side here, I have the pattern principles, because honestly, Nozick is not entirely consistent about what he means by pattern principles. At times, he seems to suggest that this is something different from time slice and end state principles that look at that, one time slice and compare the time slice in this society to this time slice in this society. But at other times, he really throws them all in together. So from our purposes, I'm just not going to treat pattern principles as anything that's distinguishable from time slice and end state principles. And I'm going to treat his arguments as if they're to go against the whole lot of them. So what problems does Robert Nozick have with time slice and end state principles? Well, it depends how you carve him up here, but I'm going to recognize three fundamental arguments that he has against anybody who uses time slice principles in order to figure out just distribution. The first is that time slices don't tell us enough about the situation actually to figure out whether it's just. Now, in order to make sense of this, let's look back at our time slice that we had in the last slide. Okay, so back to our time slice. Well, we can look at a couple of different things in these time slices. Like the utilitarian would want to be interested in, well, what's the overall utility produced by the particular society? And so 18 versus 15 seems like 18 is the more just of the two societies. And Rawls might want to look at, well, what's the balance of the two? Which one actually cares for the least off in the society the best? And well, it seems like, okay, so 4 and then 3. Well, it seems like society 2 does that. So the utilitarian and the Rawlsian might disagree when they're assessing these two societies about which one's better. But, says Nozick, we haven't found out enough. What if one of these societies or both of them depend upon slave labor in order to achieve the kind of distribution that you found in them, right? What if society 1 was a slave labor area and society 2 was a non-slave labor society? Well, that would make a significant difference to whether we actually thought it was just. But if we just look at the time slices, we haven't looked at these conditions which actually might make it just or unjust. Now, this argument clearly works against utilitarianism as an account of justice because, yeah, the utilitarian really does not care about what system it is that brings about the particular kind of happiness. And so you could imagine that. What if there was like a beneficent form of slavery, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but a beneficent form of slavery in which the masters were not too bad to the slaves and the slaves provided the labor and it actually increased overall utility? Well, it seems, again, like the utilitarian would have to accept that as actually a valid form of government and not pay attention to where the happiness came from or who it came from, but just look at the totals. It's not clear that it works as an argument against John Rawls, and this is because Rawls doesn't actually just have the difference principle as his only principle of justice. He's also got other things like equal liberty, right, which was prioritized over the difference principle. And I think at this point, Rawls could pretty much come back to Nozick and say, okay, you haven't really gotten me with this argument because you've missed the whole point. My thing was not just about distribution, it was about liberty and concern for people as well as distribution. But Nozick isn't done yet. Argument 2. Well, time slices are a picture of a particular society at a given time. What is the distribution in them? And if we have a picture of that distribution, then the idea is, well, we can assess whether it's just or unjust. Well, Nozick's problem here is that at least in a free society where people are allowed to make their own choices and have their own liberties, that there is no actual one time slice that's stable because people are constantly making decisions about what to do with their own goods and they're constantly exchanging these goods. So imagine we took a time slice at time 1 and we noted that there was unjust distribution, and so then somebody stepped in and we corrected the distribution. So in time 2 we actually set things back to just. We redistributed all the goods in the society and given them to different people. Well, says Nozick, in the next moment people are going to make free decisions to exchange goods and the distribution is going to go all out of whack again, at which point you've got to come in, step in, redistribute everything and rearrange everything again, and you got to continue doing this because time slice analysis doesn't really pick up on the dynamism of a free society. And he gives an example of this, which has become kind of famous as the Wilt Chamberlain example in political philosophy. So there's Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain, who was, of course, a famous basketball player. And Nozick posits, okay, what if we had a society where we started off with everybody absolutely egalitarian, absolutely equal, just numerically equal with each other? I mean, that seems a distribution that nobody could argue with is unjust or anything like that, right? So we start off with everybody equal in time slice 1. Well, Wilt Chamberlain comes out and he says, okay, I'm going to play a basketball game, but I'm only going to play if the people who come to the basketball game agree to give a quarter to watch the game. Now, let's imagine that everybody started off, they were equal, they were egalitarian, so everybody started out with $1, right? Well, then there's some not insignificant number of the people who are members of society who say, well, you know what, I'd actually like to see Wilt Chamberlain play in a basketball game. And so they make the free will decision to go down and pay a quarter to see Wilt Chamberlain play. Well, if there are like 1 million people, let's assume there's 1 million people who go and see Wilt Chamberlain play in this game. Then immediately after the game, we've got a very different distribution. So 1 million people now have 75 cents to their own names, and Wilt Chamberlain now has $250,000 in his bank account. But, says Nozick, has anything unjust happened between these two moments? I mean, it doesn't seem so. The people made a free decision to go down and watch a basketball game, and they chose what to do with their money, and they gave it to who they wanted to give it to, and Wilt Chamberlain agreed to play for that particular price and accepted the money in exchange. And so, says Nozick, should we go by and redistribute the wealth again the next moment? Well, no, if nothing unjust has happened in the exchanges between these two, it seems hard to justify that the distribution has somehow magically become unjust. How could it have become unjust simply because people exchanged money as they wanted to? Now, again, a utilitarian might actually have problems here because it seems like the distribution that comes out might not produce the greatest utility for the society. As a matter of fact, Wilt Chamberlain just has too much money and everybody else, well, it sucks to be them. And so the utilitarian might want to say, we should go back through and redistribute the money in this case. And again, it's not clear how much she has actually targeted Rawls with this argument. Because Rawls could come back and say, no, you're assuming that what I'm doing is coming in at a particular time slice and redistributing everything just after any particular moment. And so I'd have to come back and keep doing this over and over again. But of course, Rawls can say, I wasn't planning on doing that. I was planning on establishing something like a graduated tax code, which everybody would know and be able to understand. And they would actually be able to function in a basic market economy, knowing what the tax rates were going to be and being able to predict and plan on that. So Rawls might be able to say, I haven't really done what you seem to think that I've done here. I'm not coming in and messing with everything every few minutes. Now, Nozick could come back at him more directly and say, well, yeah, but you're certainly violating individuals' rights by collecting taxes in any case. But Nozick doesn't exactly want to do that at this time because he's trying to come up with an argument that the Rawlsian would want to pay attention to from the Rawlsian's own perspective. That's always the best way to do argument, is to try and come up with arguments that the person you're arguing with has to take seriously. And if you start from your own premises, well, it's really easy to win an argument. If it's starting from somebody else's premises, it's significantly harder. That said, eventually I think Nozick does pretty much break down and assert that, well, if you haven't agreed to all of this, then I'm going to bring back in my original premises, which is to say, you screwed up from the very beginning. You see, you've been talking about distributive justice, as if distributive justice is a thing. But distribution happens when one person or one entity holds a set of goods and they distribute it to other people. They're like you're handing out cards at a card table. And so the person who, is the dealer holds all the cards and they distribute. But he says that's not the case in a free society. See, there is no such thing as distribution. There's always redistribution, because the goods in a free society are held by the individuals who have acquired them. And if there's going to be any distribution of those goods, the state will have to come first and collect those goods from the individuals. And so this is not going to be distribution, it's going to be redistribution. And in this rhetorical move, there really is an appeal back to Nozick's fundamental absolute individual rights, in coming across with the claim that all forms of taxation would ultimately violate individual rights, something that Rawls doesn't think is true because he thinks that the ideally rational person behind the veil of ignorance would in fact agree to a kind of taxation. And so it's not a violation of the rights of individuals to tax them if, in an ideally rational state, they would in fact agree to it. So has Nozick defeated Rawls through this? Well, it kind of depends where you start from, and that's the way that we end up in lots of arguments in philosophy. If you start off with Nozick thinking that we are so defined by our separateness from other people that we want to claim absolute individual rights from the very beginning, then you want to say that it doesn't matter what the heck you think any ideally rational person from behind a veil of ignorance would do. And at that point, you follow what Nozick is saying. But if you want to follow with Rawls, then you want to say, well, no, it seems like ideally rational people will take different things into account and be able to say, no, that's not really stealing from me, this is just the way it is. Similar to how Aristotle, none of this would have made sense to him because he started with the premise that human beings were political animals and not individuals utterly separated from each other from the very beginning. So a lot of this, as always, the conclusion depends upon the premises you start with. But we can lay out what are at least 3 further disagreements between Rawls and Nozick. Now, not all of these are arguments. Some of them are just disagreements about premises, but we can go over the 3. So the 3 are, first, Rawls missed the virtue of industry. Nozick thinks that Rawls's moral account of the nature of human beings is off, because you'll remember that Rawls focused on those natural and social lotteries which dispose people towards particular dispositions of character and lead them to be more industrious or less industrious than others. Well, Nozick wants to assert more of a form of individualism, which says, no, I'm not created by these social or natural lotteries. Everything that I do, if I'm a hard worker, that's because of me. It's not because of where I came from, says this professor at Harvard. It's a nice place to get to. And so Nozick goes in exactly the opposite direction. He decides not to pay any attention to natural or social lotteries, but to go back to the fundamental Lockean position that claims that people basically own their own advantages and disadvantages, and we should just consider all of those a part of the individual. And so whatever the individual does with those is their own, and we don't have to worry about sorting that out because of luck. So people are entitled to their own advantages. Third, in a footnote, he puts forward this argument against Rawls, and I'm not entirely sure whether I buy it or not. But he claims that Rawls has put forward a standard of fairness that we would not even demand at the family level, and thus there's no way we could demand it at the society level. So imagine that you have 2 children, one of whom has, by natural lottery, received, the lion's share of the intelligence and the strength of the family, the genetic line. And so this person is really a go-getter, and they're incredibly capable. The second child, however, has not gained that. They're dumb as a rock, and they're not that fast, and they're getting by, but you don't expect great things of them. Well, Nozick says, okay, if these are your 2 children, do you in fact hold back the money that you would have paid for the older one's college in order to provide for the younger child? Or do you say that the older child, if the older child is allowed to go to college, is then obligated to take care of the younger child for the rest of his life in order to even out the luck between these 2 individuals? Now, the reason that I'm not entirely sure how successful this argument is that my moral intuitions about it aren't as clear as Nozick's apparently were. He thought that looking at this example, everybody would say, no, of course not. The parents should pay for the older one's college and not pay for the younger one's college, and the older one will be successful and the younger one won't be successful, and that's just, the way things are. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that actually I would do that. Or actually, I kind of suspect that if I did pay for college for the older one, I would kind of expect that they do take care of their sibling. So I'm not as clear on the conclusion here as Nozick was. He thought that people would be able to agree to the conclusion, and once you agree to the conclusion, then there's clearly something wrong with Rawls, because if he's applying the difference principle in society when we aren't even willing to apply the difference principle inside our family, then there's something wrong there. But I'm not entirely sure where I'm going to come down on that. Okay, at this point, we've reached the end of the negative part of Nozick's arguments, which is he's basically come through and knocked down anarchy and utilitarianism, and he thinks he's knocked down Rawls as well. And in part, he thinks that that's the majority of his job, is to come through and show that his account of the libertarian state, that minimal state, is in fact the only kind of state that could be justified. If we get rid of all the other options, then his would be the only one that's left. So he thinks that the weight of his arguments has actually been met at this point, but that doesn't mean he stops, because he goes on to suggest, at least, some really interesting things about the way that our rights work when we talk about our rights to our life, liberty, and especially to our property. So in the second lecture, I'm going to come back to talk about his position on those rights and his theory of entitlement. So, back to that in just a minute. Till then, lean back, chill out, man.